So an official good morning and welcome from me. As I say, my name's Philippa Hardman, and we run these pop-ups every month on a variety of different topics, work that we think should be seen more widely in the world. And it's really terrific to welcome Eve, who is a long-standing friend and colleague of Chris and mine and a number of other people within GameShift. We met when we all worked at Ashridge Business School and Ashridge Consulting. So a number of years ago, we've known each other. And just before everybody arrived on the screen, we were just thinking about how best to describe Eve, and because she's becoming increasingly a polymath and increasingly hard to describe. So I think I am going to ask her to describe herself in a little bit more detail, but we know Eve through education and then also as an author and as a writer and as a thinker. How else would you want to describe you?
Runner of many organisations. She runs things.
And a runner of many organisations. Yeah. Eve, how would you like to describe yourself?
Well, I started off, I suppose, being a sort of junior clerky sort of person, working in charities, and then went off and did an MBA and became a management consultant in change, particularly financial services. Then I wound up at Ashridge teaching leadership because I realised that was the only way to create sustainable change. And then I pushed off to do some research. I did a doctorate in theology and capitalism and started churning out books on how to reform capitalism and also how to do leadership properly, taking into account muscle memory and the neuroscience of how leaders learn well. And I suppose off the back of all of that, I got an abiding enthusiasm for improving organisations. So I've become a jobbing leader, doing some chairing roles and currently interim chief execing. And I've been having a panic about AI, hence the current book, which I'm going to talk to you about today.
That's terrific.
Is there anything else you want to say, Philip, before we sally forth?
No, I think in terms of anything I was going to ask about, Chris. Sorry, we'll have to be a bit techy.
I think one thing it's worth saying is, we're going to invite Eve to speak for a bit. If you've got questions that come up in the first few minutes, pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them, or Eve will pick them up as she goes. But after about 20 minutes, half an hour, we'll actually open it up to a conversation. So there'll be lots of space for questions and conversation.
Yeah, and
as we go.
And I think our encouragement is, because we all, we know some people prefer to put things in the chat, but if you're able then to join in a conversation so that we can hear some voices as well, other than just ours and Eve's, that's also really lovely. So, so Eve, I think over to you.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much for giving up your valuable breakfast slot, and I hope you've got some cornflakes with you and tea and coffee and things like that. I don't want to sort of make you feel ill this time in the morning, but the UK has published its National Risk Register for the first time, and I don't know if many of you are familiar with having to trawl through risk registers and turn everything from red to orange to green. But for the first time, they've listed AI as a chronic risk. And you'll also be aware that every day there is another open letter from a forefather of AI saying, help, stop, it's gone too far, let's have a pause, let's all, have more regulation. And the relevant select committee in the UK has also just produced an interim report asking for really an awful lot more scrutiny than we've had before. And this is because a lot of AI is currently in private hands. I think the only AI that isn't is in China, and it's arguable how publicly available that is anyway. So there is a huge degree of unknowing about AI, actually. And I think that's lending a bit of a sense of panic to the debate, because we really aren't quite sure what we're dealing with. And if the people who do know what they're dealing with are writing open letters saying panic, then that is making all of us feel extremely nervous. So I just wanted to tell you how I'm responding to that and what this book is about, in case it helps you develop a perspective on AI that may be a bit more proactive, a bit more helpful than just hoping that we can get some smart lawyers who know enough about it to kind of stop the thing getting any worse. So in AI, there is a thing called the control problem. And that's why all these people are writing letters. And the control problem is all about, how do we stop AI running amok and going rogue? And it's all about, how can you figure out how to align AI to human.
Eve, sorry.
Yes?
Eve, sorry, can I just stop you just 1 second? Jules sent a very helpful note saying, you're forgetting to pin Spotlight Eve in the picture. And I tried to do it and it said your bandwidth was low. So just before you continue, can I just try one more time? Because it just went black. So let's just see. We can see you. Can everybody see Eve now bigger?
I'm seeing nodding. This is good.
Okay, so
Great.
Carry on. If something happens...
They're very alarming. You can look at my bookcases and try and spot things that you wrote.
So it says your bandwidth is low, but we will see what happens with this. So please carry on. Sorry for interrupting you.
Great, not at all. This whole business about control and alignment is why we're having all of these letters saying we need more regulation, which is about trying to stop the thing because it seems to be sort of getting a bit unpredictable. So I wanted just to wind back a bit and talk about how we seem to have solved control and alignment in our own design as humans. So winding back a bit, AI, it's a term, people bandy it around. It could mean loads of things. When I use it in this context, I'm meaning the current attempts to copy human intelligence, largely through digital means. So it's not new by any manner of means. We've been copying humans in various ways over the centuries. Sometimes it's about physical abilities through what we would now call robotics, but may just be about developing tools that give us extension or to help us when we have problems with our bodies. Increasingly, because the improvement of bodies has become an ethical hotspot, and we know that particularly through the lessons learned globally around eugenics programs, it's become more acceptable to talk about copying minds because that doesn't seem to be so disputed. And of course, when you're trying to copy a mind, you immediately come up against some quite serious problems, which is we don't really know what a mind is. What we do know are some basic things about sort of thought processing. So if you think about how you're going to invent AI in the first place, you need to make kind of 3 intellectual leaps. So you need to have the idea that thought is a process. And that was Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan. He talked about trains of thought, and he talked about human minds doing computation. And that was really the first time someone had established this idea that thought wasn't just a kind of spontaneous, weird, spooky pink cloud thing, phenomenological event, whizzing around. It was actually a kind of start, middle, finish process. And of course, as soon as you establish that idea, that thought is a thing you can chunk up and process in that way, it leads you into the idea that if humans are computers, then you may be able to mechanize that. So then you have the problem that internationally people are having all these wonderful thoughts, trains of thought, in different languages. So how on earth do you solve the problem of different languages? That was Leibniz when he came up with his universal language, understanding that you can really condense everything down to maths. And again, that's where we got binary code from, which was a way to be able to express complex ideas in language in mathematical terms. So you've then got this idea that you could copy human thought by doing computation through numbers. And most of the early difference engines and analytical machines were doing that precisely. And then Ada Lovelace, who was working with Babbage, and he got one of these machines and she was helping him with it and doing some translation. And she thought, well, it's running on one of those card things that I've seen them use in the Jacquard looms. So in order to program the looms to make different sorts of material, they were using very similar punch cards. So she thought, well, if you can use these kinds of binary punch card things to program looms, maybe you could program anything that has some kind of logical underlay, like music. And so she made that final leap, which is you don't just need to reduce this to words and numbers. You could use this across a whole realm of human activity, provided you were able to codify it in some way. And then, of course, there's the hardware advances and the software advances, and we are where we are now, where there is quite a lot of human processing that can be simulated through computers. So where are we now? We're at a stage where most people have got an AI in their pocket because we've all had to go at ChatGPT. And of course, they've released ChatGPT, so we'll train it for them. We don't know what they haven't released. But now people have seen the sophistication of ChatGPT, which will write your essays for you, write your reports for you, do your annual accounts. Crikey, it's brilliant. It's like having an intern. And of course, we know with interns, they can be a bit crummy and you need to sort of coach them a bit and check their work. But they're jolly useful when you're busy. But it has made people panic a wee bit about, well, if this is just a sort of training version, what might AI become capable of very quickly, and what will that mean for the day-to-day of our jobs? If some of what we're doing is essentially amalgamating and data-driven in the way that these large language models seem to be very able to do. So that's sort of where we are, and why my book. So I've written a book called Robot Souls, because I was sitting on a beach, and I know you've probably been doing that all summer, and I had my children trotting around. They were sort of, splashing in the shallows and digging holes as kids do, and building sandcastles and fighting. And I looked behind me. We were in North Berwick, and there's a North Berwick Law volcanic thing. They found a Bronze Age fort up there. So I thought, gosh, this is such a timeless image of these children trotting around with doing their sandcastles and stuff. And probably this has been happening for thousands of years, little children pottering on the beach. And I thought, I wonder what will happen in 1,000 years from now. And then I felt really sad, because I thought, gosh, if the robots take over, they don't have childhood, so it would be an empty beach, and that made me feel quite bleak. So I thought, well, is there something special about humans? Should we prevail? Is there something precious and unique about us? So this book is sort of I hope not a eulogy, a hymn to our humanity. And in writing it, it's also potentially a solution to this control problem. So let me briefly say a bit about that, and then I'll have a pause so that you can ask some questions. I've come up with this idea of junk code because it occurred to me that when we were all at Ashridge, we spent quite a lot of time thinking about sustainability and biomimicry, which is the idea that if you copy nature really well, you get fantastically whizzy, innovative solutions. So we all know about Velcro being about teasels. They've figured out how you reduce drag on wind turbines by studying the fins on humpback whales. The design of nature is very sophisticated and has already solved a lot of the problems that we wrestle with in design, innovation and engineering mechanically. So it feels odd to me that when we have tried to copy humans, we've done it so badly, because it seems to me that we've taken all the easy bits that we're quite proud of, like our frightfully brainy thought processes about, chess and stuff like that. And we've put all the really embarrassing, yucky stuff like emotions and mistakes, uncertainty and intuition, whatever that is, spooky booky, and we've bunged it on the floor. That's all the junk code. And those of you who are techie types will know that junk code is the sort of term for stuff in code you're not quite sure why it's there, but you're a bit afraid of deleting it just in case it's sort of secret source, or it could be something that's been snuck in to obfuscate so people can't copy your fabulously proper code. Either way, it's stuff that doesn't seem to have any function. So the AI boffins who've been busy programming what they think is the best of themselves into AI have just deemed all this stuff kind of junk, because it's a bit complicated and not very easy to turn to zeros and ones. But when you start fiddling around on the floor, picking up all this junk code, having a look at it, you start noticing something quite interesting about it. So I've identified 7 bits of junk code, and the first one is a total disaster, which is free will. And the control problem is all about that. What happens if these AI things get free will and they start mucking about doing their own thing? Disaster. So we've got free will, which is an interesting design choice. So if you're God and you're sat there thinking, which species shall I make today? You've had to go at angels. They're pretty successful and they're quite good musicians and attractive and all that, but they can't sin, they can't make mistakes. So you think, well, wouldn't it be a cunning wheeze to see what happens if you make things that can make mistakes? Hooray! So you give your species free will, which is very stupid. So you have to immediately correct for that error, because otherwise your species will just blink out and become extinct really quickly, the first stupid mistake it makes. So you think, well, crikey, very quickly, 9 months gestation period, also questions about design there. And when you do finally have these babies, they sort of mule and squeak and they need a lot of care, don't they? You can't just sort of leave them push off down the shops, sadly. So you need to think about what would be a good bit of design that would stop us just sort of turfing these children over at the nearest bush and going back to, partying. So you create functionality to do with emotions, because emotions means that you love these things. You maybe love the person that helped you make them in the first place. You maybe love your mother because she had you. So when she gets dotty and old and annoying, you still want to hang out with her and make sure she doesn't, jump under a bus and all that kind of thing. And you create sort of kith and kin, and you create all these kinds of emotional bonds and ties that keep you with others in your species. So you start getting safety in numbers right from the word go. And then because you have this very long childhood, which we talked about on the beach, where children are a bit flaky, aren't they? And they need quite a lot of supervision. You need to figure out, what do you do before they've even got language and, braininess, to give them some good instincts to stop them, again, blinking out by running over the nearest cliff. And that's where intuition comes in, because you do need some sort of gut feel type stuff that people can access in times of need, times of danger, just at a basic level, figuring people out. Are you being lied to? Do you trust this person? Are they dangerous? Should I go into that dark wood on my own in the middle of the night when there's vagabonds around? All those kinds of things where we're not even very sure what intuition is, but we all know times it's saved our bacon or given us timely warnings about things. So if you have emotions and intuition, it kind of keeps you in community and it starts keeping you safe day to day. Then there's the problem about all this free will and making stupid decisions. So the first thing you do is you give your species a capacity for uncertainty, which is actually really important, because if you're too certain, you make really very precipitous decisions, and again, game over that cliff and, end of species. But if you have uncertainty, then not only are you able to hold things in tension and consider options, it makes you pause, it makes you think twice, and heaven forfend, it may make you ask for help. And that means you may be able to access wisdom held in other people's heads about this situation, and even your elders and betters about what they may have learned from these situations in the past. So uncertainty is actually really important to kind of slow down thought processes and, again, access collective wisdom to try and improve and de-risk your decision-making process. The other thing you do is you do have mistakes, and mistakes have two functions. One is a very mechanical thing about learning from mistakes, trial and error, and they have programmed that into robots through reinforcement learning, actually, because it's a no-brainer. And you see that in toddlers trotting about trying to learn how to walk. They fall over a lot and, pull things down with them, and then they figure out balance and they wave their arms around and, off they go. So we've all done sort of learning by trial and error. But the other interesting thing in our design is we have a sort of moral learning as well. So we make mistakes, we look around, people are making faces, people might be shouting, or they might be grinning. They might put us in the naughty step. They might not give us our pocket money, whatever it might be. So we learn over time the emotional effect of those kinds of decisions and mistakes. And we develop a conscience because we don't want those negative feelings in the future. So over time, we de-risk our ability to make future decisions by developing a conscience through having made mistakes. So uncertainty and mistakes are, again, a really important de-risking mechanism for something that you've given free will to. So then the final couple of bits of junk code are quite interesting, because they, you've consolidated the species by making sure they're traveling together, the safety in numbers. You're trying to make sure that they're not making too stupid decisions, or at least learning from them on the odd occasion that they do. So what are you going to do to motivate them to want to keep going as a species, particularly intergenerationally? And that's where the last two come in, which is meaning making and storytelling. So we have this extraordinary propensity to make meaning. I mean, crikey, we make meaning from nothing. You look up at the heavens, there's some random dots, and you go, oh, it's the plough. And you have a whole load of stories about why it's the plough, and you get very complicated about it. And then you see a black cat running across the road, and you think, or you put salt over your shoulder, you don't go under a ladder, and you read the horoscope and you think, oh, definitely, that's that man, that's what that meant. So we can't help ourselves. We just randomly make up meaning wherever we are. And that's hugely important because it generates purpose and a sense of purposefulness, which again keeps us going. And then what we do with all of that is we turn it into extraordinarily sticky stories. So all the nursery rhymes, all the fairy tales, all the stories that are hidden in the faith traditions and the wisdom traditions, all the Aesop's fables, all the myths and legends, all that stuff, it has been saved for us through the generations, and it is all condensed advice about what works, what doesn't work, what happens to bad guys, who wins, why are we here, what does good look like, all those kinds of things. It'd be very hard to communicate in any other way, but stories are very, very memorable and easy to communicate, and are a real human superpower. So then when you look at those together, you realise what they're all there for. Individually, they might look like the sort of thing you'd sack a robot for, but when you look at them in the round, you realise they're an incredibly clever design to try very hard to stop this potentially wayward creation from self-imploding. And when you look at it like that, you start thinking, well, not only should we be a bit more protective about these fabulous bits of coding that we have and enjoy and make more of them, But we should also think about what we could learn from that for trying to figure out, how do we relate to AI? What do we do to design these kinds of things into AI, so we don't just need to run around panicking, slapping legislation on the top with hindsight, which probably won't do very much. Because if we get the design right, we'll need a lot less regulation and legislation in future. So that was quite a brain dump. So I'll pause there to start taking some questions and having a conversation, and we can maybe go into, you know, dodgy terrain like robot rights and everything else like that. But let's just test the water and see where you are. So how has that landed? Any questions, any jargony things that would be helpful to clear up? Any thoughts or concerns?
So I think, Eve, we'll just be quiet for a minute and let people speak. So please switch yourself off mute and just speak if you can.
So Tom's put a question in about Mo Gaudat, and Mo is ex-Google, possibly still Google actually, and he's got a big thing about the relationship we should have with AI should be parental, and I talk a bit about that in my book because I think he's quite right about that. There's something interesting happening with ChatGPT already, that we're needing to be quite parental in terms of coaching it into better behaviours. And he is very much at one end of the spectrum that feels that we will definitely lose the race if that's what it is with AI. AI will take over. It's a matter of time. And therefore, instead of being idiots about it, we've learned from our history that actually making friends with marauders early may be a better strategy than holding out to last bastions. And he thinks these are creations that we are responsible for making. In the same way that we give birth to our children, and then we need to deal with all of these very tricky things like how much freedom do you give them, you know, what sort of punishment regime do you have, what sort of reward regime do you have, how do you adjust that over time, and think about what we've learned from, again, thousands and thousands of years of parenting around the right combination of kind of tight loose around controlling something that we're increasingly giving free will to. So Tom, do say more about that if you want to.
I don't think I know as much as you already, recapping on it, Eve. I just wanted to check that I'd understood what you were saying as being fairly close to what I've read him saying.
Yeah.
Good morning, and good morning everybody as well. Lovely to see you. And what a great talk that was just now. And I wonder if I could ask a question or for your thoughts on the two things that you've combined: your work in Ashridge and your insight into artificial intelligence. Because I'm working in an AI firm until today. Actually, I'll be leaving today. But and one of the things I feel when I'm working in with these tech firms, they can be quite brutal. And I think it's the combination, you talked about leadership and talked about AI, and I wonder if it's the combination of the leadership styles in these AI companies, these tech leaders that have created this way of being. And I wondered from Ashridge hat on, as it were, how we can start tackling AI leadership to start, controlling or managing AI.
It's such a good spot because it is playing out. I mean, you make things in your own image, don't you? And it's very interesting. I think when I first joined Ashridge, they had a regime where every new person had to be bundled off to OPP to learn Myers-Briggs and learn everything there was to know about psychometrics and get accredited and, the whole thing. And in those days, the people that came to Ashridge loved Myers-Briggs, but everyone else was really snotty about it, particularly the scientists who'd write these journal articles saying it's all hogwash and superstition and horoscopes. And of course, what's quite hilarious about the AI community is they suddenly got batty about psychometrics, particularly the big five, which of course is statistically much more reliable than anything else that could ever have been invented by a couple of ladies sitting at their dining room table in the 20s. And they are using that increasingly, as we all know, from what happened with autonomy and the elections and everything, to profile people. And they're using the big five to do incredibly targeted analysis and social media and lobbying and all kinds of stuff, because it is a very useful tool. And of course, when you then start playing them at their own game on that, you realize that the AI already has a big five profile. It is a fairly extreme version of ISTJ, I'd say, in old money, certainly verging on the psychopathic, because by design, we have deliberately not put conscience into AI because we weren't sure how to do that exactly, and it was all a bit dodgy and scary. So you start thinking about, the average profile of a kind of AI coder, the tech community in general, the sort of hiring patterns, it's no wonder that the firms are behaving in a particular way and their AIs are behaving in a particular way. But of course, they do now have the technology to solve their own problem because they've embraced the big five. So some of it is about trying to get them to use their own tools to analyze themselves, to realize that there are some natural gaps, that actually the strength of humanity is in our diversity. And we see that all over creation, that if you don't have diversity, species just disappear, because it's about resilience and it's about risk management. And if you create one AI with one personality, with one range of coding, then it's incredibly vulnerable to, the right hacker or the right virus or whatever. So there is something about saying, well, that's great that you've got this sophisticated, super brainy thing, but actually, are you taking account of all these other things we've learned from humanity that actually would de-risk your creation, as well as make it more competent and effective? But it's a good shout. I mean, I think those of us who work with tech firms can see that there is work to be done around building.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And please join me in, I want to start a massive campaign to try and manage tech leadership first, because I think that's where this is how we've got where we have. Sorry.
I've had some opportunity to spend time recently with the community of physicists at the Parry Centre that may be known to some of you. If you haven't heard of the Parry Centre, I commend you to check it out in relation to this talk, which is quite brilliant. But the heart of what excites me and what you said was the importance of uncertainty.
Yes.
Which goes right across. I'm not a scientist in any capacity. I get, my school told me I was on the art side, and that was the end of that. And I am fascinated by how uncertainty is at the heart of all of their work. It was a revelation to me, the importance of uncertainty. And I think the link between what you're doing and what they're doing at the Parry Centre, inspired by the ideas and vision of David Bohm, is an important link to make. I commend it.
Thank you. And that's really helpful.
Hearing how you've progressed your thinking and your ideas, it's just it's so stimulating to listen. It isn't just interesting. I'm really impressed.
That's brilliant. So I talked about the fact they were using mistakes in reinforcement learning to try and accelerate the learning of the algorithms in the more sophisticated AIs. But of course, they've had to program uncertainty in, because, for instance, with image scanning, if you've got a whole load of cancer scans and you're giving the computer a binary choice of ones and zeros, what does it do if it gets a fuzzy image and it's not entirely clear whether that's cancer or not? And if it puts it in the wrong bucket, then someone could die. So what they've had to do is use Bayesian AI and all the uncertainty stuff we've learned from Bayes to program in a kind of voting mechanism where all the different neural networks essentially vote on the image. And if there isn't a particular tolerance reached around agreement on certainty, it gets escalated to a real person who'll say, well, that's just a crap image, it's a bit blurry, we'll do it again. So it's really interesting when you start looking at what uncertainty is for rather than rejoicing in it, because it is there for some very, very good reasons. It's not just a kind of fun thing that some personality types enjoy more than others. It's really important.
There's a few things that, I mean, again, there's just so many directions we could go in, isn't there? I'm reminded of, as a sort of, my guilty pleasure is definitely what I think is now called speculative fiction rather than sci-fi. But there's a really nice book by, I think it's James Smythe, called I Still Dream, which is told over decades, starting in the 70s, 80s, with a young woman and her development, and she goes into coding and she developed an AI. But to the point around the context in which it's developed, there's a sort of bifurcation in this story where she develops her AI in a very relational way, whereas the kind of men in the I go men, I don't know why I go men, it was men, and the men in the in the big firms that she had been working in are getting, they're playing Pong, and it's a much more competitive environment and so on. So it's a really nice story that then obviously projects that forward as to where that goes. And you can imagine there's a disaster afoot somewhere in the midst of the story and so on. But it's that issue of what's the context in which things are developing. Because I think the link to that, the other thought that was going on for me when you were talking was this difference between design and evolution. The sense that, I mean, you were talking about us as if there was a grand design somewhere. I guess depends on your point of view, but a sense that that's actually something that's evolved over millions of years, with all the unsuccessful branches and roots, that lead us to this very sort of complex interplay of all of these types of issues. And clearly we're starting to get to that in the AI world as well, and well, get to it. We've been there for a long time, in that sense. I think that's something else I'm reading at the moment. It's called something like Overcomplicated, which is essentially making the point that for some time nobody understands this. I mean, the idea that there is somebody sitting there, knowing how it all works, even the basic things, the tools we use every day, nobody actually knows how the totality of that works. But then, of course, we don't know how the totality of our lives work either. Again, the idea that we understand the environment that we're in, we have very partial sight of that too. So I don't know where I'm
just to respond to that last bit first. I mean, I think you all need to decide what your teleology is about humankind, because that's really important. I happen to have a religious background, but the prevailing belief is about evolution, whether you then add some jiggery-pokery around it to do with God or gods or whatever. But this is my starting problem, which is that evolution is about improvement. It is about survival, but therefore about improvement in order to survive. And if you're looking at it through that lens, then our design has, as you say, evolved over many, many years to try and future-proof us as far as possible. So the twofold problem with that, one is, why aren't we learning more about that, which is where all my junk code comes in, because I think that's what it's all about. But also, if your narrative is denuded of any kind of sense of wider meaning and purpose, and we are literally just a load of meat that is on the march for kind of glory, then actually, if improvement is the goal, then why wouldn't we just evolve into AI and push off to the golf course? Because job done. If evolution is about perfection, then we can become more perfect through technologies than we can, and faster than we can by just loafing about, hoping evolution will eventually get us there. So it starts getting really tightly wound into your view about who you are and why you're here. And that's why I started really looking at it, was to try and develop my own thinking about whether we should, delegate it all to the robots and push off and we'll be the last generation and that's fine, or whether there'd be a problem with that. But talking about your point about speculative fiction, I mean, what's really interesting, there's a chapter in the book about this, because if you follow writers like Neil Stevenson, who of course is a speculative fiction guy rather than a sci-fi guy by his own parlance, he talks about sci-fi in general as idea porn, because he says that whenever you have a dangerous idea, in order to avoid being locked up, you couch it as fiction. And Moore did this with Utopia. It's not a new idea, but if you want to try and experiment with what would happen if women had rights, or robots took over, you write something set in the future, so no one can lock you up and send you away and tell you're a dangerous dissident. So actually, if you're trying to look at our best thinking about who we are and where we're going, you normally find that in speculative fiction rather than anywhere else. And so one good way to analyse all our potential futures in terms of scenario planning is to analyse all the plot arcs of as much sci-fi as you can possibly get your hands on. So there is a bit in the book about that, because it's too big a task for me to take on. But luckily, when Max Tegmark wrote his book, Human 2.0, he did a very good meta-analysis of story arcs about, zookeeper and, do we end up just being sort of pets for robots, or who takes over who, and do we become cyborgs and all that? Which again, given that we know the sort of range of potential futures, it's interesting that we've just gone, ha ha ha, and eaten more popcorn rather than think, maybe we should be planning for some of this stuff and think about what this might mean about protections and human rights and, stuff like that, because we are running out of time, because this stuff is catching up really fast. And even thinking about basic legal protections like the Human Rights Act, how far would that really protect us if an AI was able to argue that it was human successfully? So there's
Eve, I was just going to say, actually, Jules has put in a question about, can a robot learn what it is to have a soul, which perhaps just follows on exactly from what you were just saying. And then Tom's made another comment.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, Jules, I mean, this is spot on, because a robot can absolutely learn what it is to have a soul. I think the question is, can it have the same experience as us, as how we feel about having a soul, whatever we think that might mean? And again, there's a lot of stuff in the book about, consciousness and what it is. And the famous bit on this is Thomas Nagel's essay on what is it like to be a bat, that you may have heard about. He was obsessed with, how bats feel about things. And he's developed this concept of batness, which is, we don't know what it's like to be a bat, but a bat does. We know what it's like to be Eve or Hugh or Jules, but I don't really know what it's like to be Hugh. Only Hugh really knows that, because he has to have his own lived experience of that. So we suspect various things have consciousness, because they can talk to us about it if they're humans, and if they're a bat, we can kind of imagine, because of things like feeling pain and behaviors, because we have simulations and parallels in human experiences, we kind of ascribe properties to bats and mammals and other animals as having consciousness and sentience and all those kinds of things, which is why we then have a rights regime about animals in particular. But we can't say hand on heart that we know what it's like to be a bat. So by that logic, a robot could have robotness. They could be quite clear that this is what it's like to be a robot. This is what it's like to have a robot soul. And we couldn't really tell them off about that, because we don't know. We could be patronising about it and say, it's not a human experience, though, is it? But then you've got to be really sure about what is our right to say we're the best species. Are we the apex predator by any right? I mean, if the dolphins were better than us, if the mice could come up and bring up the rear, should we push off? It's speciesist to say that we're the best. Unless you have a particular argument for that. And again, it's a really important thing we all need to think about, which is, what makes you so special? Because actually, increasingly, we can just tell the robots how to do all this stuff. And unless you're going to get prissy about what does it feel like to see the colour red, and is that the most authentic thing that anyone can ever experience, then that's a big question. And I think because consciousness is so sexy and difficult, it's a really great way to keep people really busy, panicking away about consciousness. Meanwhile, we ignore the point, which is free will, which is actually the worrying thing. It doesn't really matter if an AI has consciousness or not. I mean, great, fantastic if they can hear opera and love it, if you think that's important. But actually, the thing that we should really be interested in is what happens if these things are autonomous and independent, which increasingly they are able to be. Because that's actually where our relationship with them becomes really quite important. It'll be nicer for us if they're conscious, because we get that, but it's not necessary, I don't think. So Tom, let me just quickly read what you said there. Conceptions and I think there is a really interesting thing. This whole idea about having designed something which is incredibly individualistic. We know that the way we have evolved, we're quite used to harnessing knowledge held in other people's heads and other communities in the past as well. And I wonder what it'd be like, in the same way that we have symposia and we invite Nobel Prize winners to dinner, and that one is an expert in dark matter and that one's an expert in Shakespeare, and we have this really interesting conversations across these disciplines. I was wondering what it'd be like if you had AlphaGo, AlphaFold, DeepMind, ChatGPT, you bung them all in a room together and to have a chat, because they're not learning from each other. And I think we're all quite terrified about what on earth would happen if they did. Because there is something about lightning quick processing that we don't have access to. And we just don't know what kinds of intelligence might be possible. And one of the great hopes is that we are constrained by our ability to have knowledge and wisdom. You know, if an AI was able to be more knowledgeable, could it be wiser? Would it be able to make better decisions than we can? And you know,
which Eve is a kind of a faith-based position, isn't it? So you end up, you know, with something like Lovelock in Nova Scene, you know, who basically said we should hand it all over, really, in some ways, because AI will look after the planet much better than we will. And actually it will help us to solve our wicked problems. But I'm also reading things that said you can't get a more wicked problem than AI itself.
Yeah, and I think a good example of this is what happened during COVID, when it dawned on the UK population that the Westminster government were pursuing a programme of herd immunity. And we all suddenly felt a bit sick about the idea that we were going to throw all our grannies and disabled children under a bus to you know, save the master race. And that felt kind of disgusting. But actually, if you have only programmed the non-junk code into an AI and you're using the default morality, which is not considered morality, it's just considered sensible decision making, which is utilitarianism, that is entirely governed by optimizing outcomes. So wouldn't it be a jolly good wheeze if you did herd immunity? Because then you save everyone shed loads of money, and you save massive amounts of money on the NHS, welfare state. You know, it's a total bargain. It's a gift from Darwin. You know, it's a plague sent from God to kind of wipe out all the weak and the people that are costing us a load of money and being tedious. And actually, it's only because we're human and we have a belief, most of us, whether we're religious or not, in the dignity of the person, that we feel that's outrageous. So you're right, Chris, you could have a kind of AI overlord. At the moment, though, I think they've made crap decisions, not good decisions, because I don't think they've been given the technology to make better ones, because they have a very stunted morality, which can only ever optimize outcomes. And that it just is one ethic amongst many. And that's one of the things that we need to correct, I think. It should kill us all, though. You're right, in order to solve the problem of the planet. Just think about land use in the UK. If you think about how many... It's a massive percentage of the UK that is given over to farming, which is incredibly inefficient, because, you know, AIs are going to need energy. They're not going to need burgers. So it would be much better just to get rid of all these stupid people who eat burgers, so that you can use the land for energy. Or you could maybe just, you know, get, you know, those things in sci-fi that they feed us pills and stuff instead, which you can just make in factories, Silent Green and whatever. We could do that instead if you want to keep some humans around because you think they're cute. But again, we need to be really clear about what we think our purpose is and what value we add if you want to have those kinds of conversations, particularly if we are deliberately trying to outsource everything to the AI and create something better than us by definition. Because this is the first time, I think, all the other tools are about making our lives easier or quicker or more fun, whatever. This is the first time we've actually set about trying to replace ourselves. So we didn't really have an exit strategy for that, did we? And that's why I think there's all this panic. But I think that we can recover a fair amount of ground if we remember our own design and learn from the wisdom of that.
I'm just thinking, Eve, just around that, you know, we didn't set out to do this. It implies that AI happened, you know, and it happened because people set out with the purpose of replacing ourselves or whatever. And I wonder if actually part of the fear around AI is because the perception is there's some whizzy kids, predominantly male, I imagine, in California or wherever, who are doing really interesting stuff that the majority of us don't really understand. You know, they talk about code and we don't understand it. And therefore, I wonder if there's how much appetite there might be in these places to have conversations like this about the work that they are doing, because I have a real sense that we, the lay people and governments, are furiously just trying to catch up, but we're so far behind. And I'm wondering, therefore, you know, we feel quite nervous, I think, about having these conversations, but I wonder the people we really need to be having conversations with are the AI tech people, wherever they are doing their stuff. And I wonder what appetite there is for that amongst the industry, if you like, and whether you've seen anything about that.
Well, there's sort of two responses to that. One is that the game board isn't laid out very well, because if you are setting capitalist organizations against each other who are privately owning all these things and competing with each other to try and be first to market on something really whizzy and cool, you're not really incentivizing any kind of cooperation or any kind of pause, any kind of slowdown, even though there are a number of tech giants who are sort of arguing for that. So there is a sort of structural problem with trying to get some cooperation. But my optimistic thought would be that because this is actually about the management of risk, and it's about saying, you've got a problem that you're calling a control problem, actually we know how to fix it because we've already fixed it in humanity. I mean, don't get me wrong, we all completely cock up, and humans are very, very wayward, but there are some mitigations that have been built in to try and reduce that as far as possible, and it's trying to understand what those mitigations are that I think could be of commercial use, if you like, to these outfits, because they're running out of ideas. They don't want to talk to theologians because, I mean, God is all weird anyway. They don't want to talk to ethicists because it's all like long words and fuck off. So there's all this stuff about who are they talking to, because those kinds of people don't have credibility. But risk management is something which is very topical and is very necessary to sort out, particularly when you've got all this global panicking about the control problem. So it feels to me that this unusually might be a way into those conversations by saying, well, look, you've got a problem and this is how we think you could fix it.
Is there a possibility of a future collaboration? Because it seems as if the model that's kept our free will in check, or our free will kind of contained or constrained, has worked so far, although there's sort of reasonable evidence mounting to suggest that that's only so far. I'm kind of wondering about the potential. I mean, this feels a major disruption in our way of thinking about what's life about, what's meaning about, what's that disruption has the potential to lead us to being something that unlocks different models of operating and being.
Yeah, I think that's such a good thought. And I think on cooperation, there are some things I think will naturally happen that start breaking down some of these barriers. So, for instance, in academia, where a lot of this started, robotics and AI are totally different endeavors. And of course, as I said at the beginning, copying bodies has become terribly ethically fraught, so we don't tend to talk about that. But robotics, now that it can use AIs in its machines, is creating the most incredible gains very, very quickly in terms of what robots can do. Because of course that's why we learn really quickly, because of our bodies and how we were being in 3D, and therefore the capacities we needed in terms of consciousness and processing for that to work. So AI has suddenly realized that, they've solved Go, they've solved chess, they can do protein folding, but they've kind of got stuck now. And now they're looking over the wall and thinking, crikey, these robots can repair themselves. They can reprogram themselves on the moon to repair themselves. That's free will from where we're sitting. What could we learn from that? And the fact that there's a bit in my book at the beginning about this walking robot that was just like Thing in the Addams Family. And it just had four legs, and it was an experimental thing. They just put a couple of very basic neural networks in it, and given it very little programming, but just an objective, which is get to the other side of the pen. And to begin with, it was a bit rubbish. It was flopping about, and it took it ages, about 4 or 5 days, to figure out how to manipulate itself and then how to move to the other side. So they pulled it back and ripped a leg off to see if it could relearn with 3, because of course that's the kind of thing that might happen on the moon. It'd lose a leg and it would need to reprogram itself. So it was all working brilliant, and they were dead chuffed. So they thought, right, we'll analyze all this so we could do a big fancy pants trade demo. So when they started interrogating the neural nets to try and understand how it had taught itself to learn from scratch virtually, they discovered this quite alarming thing, which is the blighter had taught itself to read their expressions. They were all been standing around the pen, obviously watching this thing, and it had been looking at them, trying to figure out what faces they were making. And again, they were like, oh, crikey, we didn't expect that. But of course, if you've been around kids for long enough, that's totally what happens when they're toddlers. They're all pottering about and you go, ooh, ah, ah, and you're doing all that kind of, encouragement and all that stuff. And they pick that up from you. And that's part of how they learn how to walk. So it was actually this thing being frightfully cunning, with very little to go on. And so that's, I think, what started the robotics community thinking, that's kind of self-awareness in a kind of level. So what does that mean in terms of how quickly these things might be learning when you factor bodies in? So I think you're right, Graham. It's asking us some really difficult questions about all kinds of things. And it's particularly asking us to go back to embodiedness again, and understand what role that has in our lives and learning. Because the thing about AI is it tried to just turn us all into something that could be put into a machine in a disembodied way. And of course, it seems that in our design, bodily learning is as important as the kind of mind learning, however you want to construct that.
Eve, there are some comments in the chat that I'll just give you a minute to read from Tom and from Nima and from Adam.
Yes, I think it's really interesting, the race that governments are having to try and get to understand what tech firms are doing. They're very reliant on whistleblowers and people who have left. And again, that they're understanding dates very quickly. So that is very tricky. It's like any kind of cybersecurity stuff going on at the moment. You're only really as good as your hackers and your whistleblowers. And that, I think that is a problem given how massive these firms are. And Tom, yeah, thank you. The consciousness, it is fascinating when you start thinking, why would you copy humans actually? And if you think about literature, I mean, could you have a robot literature? If you think about our literature, it's all about humans being crap and cocking up and making terrible decisions and falling in love with the wrong person. And actually you just wouldn't have any of that, would you, if you were robots? Because that's not very interesting. So it is really good stuff about who we are and what's the point of us. OpenAI. Adam, do you want to say more about that, about what OpenAI are up to on their own citizen assemblies and things? Do you think that is having an effect? Do you think it's working?
Not yet. So essentially what I was referencing there was towards the question around appetite, of the gap that's between sort of citizens and the makers of these platforms. And I think we saw the first signs of that gap when the big tech companies were brought into Congress. You saw the disparity between where we are and where we think we are. That was essentially in regards to ChatGPT, OpenAI, a very small amount of their resources, financial resources, were put out to public applications to organizations and individuals to host citizen assemblies on this matter. And you're seeing citizen assemblies being considered slightly more around the world towards navigating this. But I think the challenge is having them weighted enough that they hold impact and change post them happening. But I think what I like about the citizen assembly model to this conversation is, I think, two things. One, there's I think evident in our conversation today, there's almost an initiation being brought forth to us by AI in regards to what is our essential humanness, and we're all being asked to stand forth in all our vulnerability of what makes us uniquely us. And I think that's wonderful, if not challenging. But because of that, the complexities of that need a forum which can hold the size of us beyond binary voting, for example. And I think that's what I like about the two spaces might be close enough for that to happen.
Yeah. And I think for all of us, everyone on this call and everyone that you know, some of it is about being brave enough to tool up. I think it's very convenient for the industry for us to think this is all sci-fi and just to do it at the movies and not to actually engage and to imagine it's all in the future. And it's also very convenient if we're terrified of the complexity and the jargon and not understanding it, because then that means everyone can crack on. So a lot of my book is a massive glossary and incredibly detailed index, because some of this is about figuring out, what do you think about the singularity? What do you think about, machine learning as opposed to other sorts of reinforcement learning and deep learning and all these kinds of stuff that is bandied about in the paper, and you're like, oh, that sounds a bit complicated, because actually it's not really. The book is basically a demystifier so that we're not scared of this stuff. That's what I did with my capitalism book, because again, it was the same thing. It's not helpful for capitalists if you start saying, hang on a minute, Where's all this money coming from when you create a loan? But unless we're asking those questions, we get quantitative easing and we don't get investment information. So it's the same thing with AI. And unless we figure out how to talk this language, how do we stop being bullshitted to, then we can't challenge it and we can't see where there are dangerous assumptions creeping in or people being left out of conversations. So, whether it's my book or just doing a bit of Googling or asking ChatGPT to give you a bit of a tutorial, it is worth trying to invest a bit of time getting up to speed on this stuff, because it is happening much faster than I think we all thought it would. And a lot of it will have impacts on all our day-to-day jobs, just because it is the latest tool in town, and using it well will be a massive differentiator for workforces in the short term, certainly.
I'm very, as I listen to you on this subject, I'm just really struck, Eve, by the words you used earlier, how to stop potential wayward creation imploding. We are ourselves as a civilization in a potential wayward creation imploding state.
Yes.
The planet is at risk, of which we're a part. The entire show is at risk. What you said just then was that it's all happening faster. Well, it's all happening faster in the world of AI thinking. It's all the challenges to the planet are all happening faster too.
Yes. Yeah.
And if the thinking, it's a kind of free thinking capacity. I observe you having just the capacity to just flip from one thought to another thought to another thought. It's stimulating and liberating all at once in the confines of this particular topic. But it's also what we need in addressing the challenges that face us on the planet as a civilization. We have to loosen the fixities, the rigidities of our thinking process within the terms of reference of the present planet. In other words, using the same associative free thinking process that you've just been employing for the last hour.
That's so true. And the thing is that this is an existential risk. Obviously, the planet imploding is the other big risk that we're all aware of. We became crucially aware of pandemic risk through coronavirus. And, every day there is now reporting on comets because of whatever that movie was. There are lots of ways that we could be killed off. You just need to go to your nearest museum with the kids and it explains about dinosaurs. And, we will eventually die as a species. That's what happens to species. But we happen to have a degree of control over this that maybe some other species didn't have. At the moment, as you say, Hugh, we're accelerating our own demise through global warming and much faster than we'd all thought. AI would be a potential response to that because it would give us more tools to understand more about how do we get on top of that, in the same way that AI could help us solve problems about global inequality around all kinds of stuff, whether it's medicine or food distribution or any of these kinds of things. And that's why it's not very helpful if we just get into a panic about, robot overlords, because actually there's something about trying to figure out, there are lots of harms possible. We can already see that through, gaming elections and mucking about. But there is something about how do we get behind this for the positive things that we could get involved with creating out of this. And to make sure, thank goodness they released ChatGPT, because then we can train it for them. Because if it's only trained on training data, that learning model, 50% of its data is only from 9 global institutions, most of them based in the US. So it's on a really sticky wicket in terms of, garbage in, garbage out. That's why we have all this bias and all that kind of stuff, because we're only feeding it certain sorts of data. So again, please do engage with ChatGPT and ask it existential questions and ask it whether it likes the color blue and ask it all kinds of crazy nonsense, because it's got to learn this stuff in order to be a better tool. And we can already help with that, even if we think the whole thing's a bit weird. So there are some really big questions, as you say, Hugh, about how do we just embrace the outrageous suggestion that we may not be special and try and understand what is special about us that could be helpful. And rather than engaging in this whole debate in fear, as we heard from Tom's question about Mo Gaudat, what we do with our children is we try to love them, not imagine they're going to eventually bung us in an old people's home and push off. We don't tend to worry about that from day one. And maybe we need to be try very hard to love AI and figure out how we could help it, rather than figure out how we could just box it and pretend we never did it, which seems to be what these letters are about, which is, I think, would be probably not possible, but also a deficient response.
Eve, you've got a couple of questions from Adam. So if you found yourself within a global group working to create global governance on AI, first of all, what question or questions would you ask and hold as essential? And how would or do you display your unique human contribution, I assume, within that grouping?
So, Adam, I'm really hot on robot rights, and I'll just say a couple of quick things about that, because it tends to be one of those things that just makes people panic and think, oh, fuck off, toasters don't have rights, that's ridiculous. But actually, if you think about rights and the whole debate on rights, I mentioned animals earlier and batness, and we've kind of decided that it wouldn't be a good look if we start, kicking dogs and putting shampoo in rabbits' eyes. We've kind of got rules about that, because we think probably these animals feel pain, therefore it's horrid of us. And also, it's not a nice thing for humans to be, being horrid to animals. So it's about protecting animals, but it's also about protecting us by stopping us being bad guys. If you think about why we've given rights to corporations, we haven't given corporations rights because we're really worried that they might weep if we're horrid about them on Twitter. We've given them rights because we want to sue the buggers if they're naughty. And actually, one of the problems with AI is that we don't really know. AI doesn't really have a downside. If it wants to sort of use this car to run over our favorite pussycat, then who do we sue? And it would take you years, and you'd be in forever. So there is something about the debate on rights. Well, whatever you think about what sorts of rights would be appropriate and what kind of status would that give an AI, there is a really important debate to be had, which is if you understand why we have decided rights are a thing, then you start thinking, well, okay, is there a threshold of batness or looking sad when you put shampoo in people's eyes or wincing or something that we would think if a robot achieved that threshold, we would imagine there was a degree of sentience or something that would make us feel those sorts of rights should kick in. But equally, and this gets into sex bots, should we be allowed to have sex with robots, particularly robots that have been simulated to look and feel and behave like people, particularly with brain technologies? Because they could never give us reasonable consent, could they? We don't really know what that would look like. But it's not good for humans to be shagging machines and abusing machines. So that's, again, about protecting us as well as protecting the machines. Same thing with autonomous weapons, by the way. It should be a human right to kill another human. That should be a restricted thing. It shouldn't be that you could just randomly let weaponry do that without there being some kind of human oversight. So there is a load of stuff in here which gets into what we think we should be like, and what is our behavior and what would police us, as well as what do we think these things we're assigning rights to should be like. And then, of course, the thing about corporations and rights gets you into this whole thing about who do you sue and what happens, what's the downside, what's the upside, all those kinds of things. So in governance, that's what I would be talking about. The other thing I'd be talking about in governance is the UK has just produced their sort of first pass through the Commons report, the Select Committee report. But they're not as sophisticated as the Europeans on this. There's a great distinction in the European thinking between what they call a deterministic robot, which is a kind of basic AI that kind of, does things fairly mechanicalistically and kind of computationally, and what they call a cognitive robot, which has all this deep learning technology so it can teach itself, and therefore it becomes by definition unmanageable and unpredictable, because it can reprogram itself, it can make its own decisions, it gets, quotes, free will. So they have a distinction between how you would legislate those two things. So for instance, you might allow deterministic robot sex toys, because we already have those, frankly, but you wouldn't allow cognitive robot sex toys because there would be a line being crossed there. So in the UK, we're only really still panicking about deterministic robots and garbage in, garbage out, and how do we stop bias and how do we kind of stop, people taking over and fake news. But that's all assuming a fairly discrete sort of understanding of AI, which we've already breached, and that bird has flown. But it's much more user-friendly just to focus on that and think it's all just about sort of mucking about, talking about data control and algorithms and audit, than to talk about the scary Mary stuff, which is what happens if a robot has the capacity to go rogue, and what do you do about that? So I'd also want Adam to push that kind of distinction they've established in Europe, and make sure that that is also something we're talking about in the UK, and more generally about different types of AI, and therefore what regimes would be appropriate depending on what technologies you've given them, particularly the learning technologies. And Nima, you got a question about yeah, and this is brilliant. This is about are we giving us as much scrutiny to, you know, the pharmacologists or the aircraft engineers? There's a really interesting thing that again isn't coming up in the UK conversation on regulation about professionalism. So in the medical profession and other professions that are quite high risk, we have a sort of inbuilt security mechanism, which is, even if you're working for a filthy nasty corporation that's a profit maximizer, you also have a professional line, and you could get struck off if you're naughty. So that kind of keeps you safe around sort of legal decisions and medical decisions and other kinds of professional decisions, because there's sort of a different regulatory regime. In AI, there isn't really a professional body for AI types. So you're only really driven by, you know, the overlord, whoever it is you're working for, and in the current situation, that's all corporations. So again, maybe in my conversation that Adam was asking about regulation, I would be interested in when are we going to start having a professional body for AI, and how would we make that strong and global, so that there would be another line of accountability that would help you understand a bit about behaviours and the kind of honour code of people working in this industry, rather than it just being a kind of offshoot of making pots and pans and making tin cans that think.
Thanks, Eve. I completely feel that's the route we go down, and I kind of, because we get worried about, because we're obviously hearing these things, and that's why we think we need to go talk to tech firms, or we need to tool up and learn about generative AI technology, and how deep learning, and we have to learn the terms, and we haven't learned the terms in how a COVID vaccine was produced. Really, we learned a lot more because it was on the TV so much, but how much do we really know about these things? We're kind of expecting firms to do the right thing in those areas, and we're not expecting to know the technology and learn the technology for each of these. But we've got into this position of, I feel, thinking that we need to learn technology, go on some coding course, because of you talked about uncertainty in the robot, and I also align that to anxiety. So it's a good thing to stop us doing crazy things, but we're experiencing this anxiety and uncertainty because they are not this amorphous body of AI leaders are not able to give us more clarity, and clarity particularly about how they are deploying AI, and we are I put a little thing earlier about how trust is actually, it's around 14% in AI firms, as some of the surveys coming back. So I think it all lies with them. The responsibility lies with them, and that means that we have to push governments and people to do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, the do no harm thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. But amazing talk. You're an incredible person.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we all are. That's why I wrote the book, because we're all special and precious.
I'm conscious in a remark by Julie Dryborough, who said she'll catch the end on the video and had to leave at that point. I don't want to leave without saying just how extraordinarily, what an exemplar this is for how to use Zoom.
Good.
I've been in so many tedious, structurally tedious, fascinating topic, but structurally tedious Zoom calls where people misuse the chat and spend endless time besting each other for the cleverness of their entries in the chat, and the imposition of muting so that nobody laughs, nobody coughs. It's an unreal, uneasy making arena within which to develop streams of thought. It's clunky, endlessly clunky, and this is the first. And I've been on Zoom pretty well every day for most months. This is the first one that I've just delighted in from moment to end.
It's marvellous to hear it, Hugh. It's because Philippa and I replaced ourselves with robots some years ago. It's all been much better since then.
Yeah, we don't exist below the shoulders.
This is, in fact, all we are now. Just me.
I'm just wondering, because I'm conscious of time, and just wanting to make sure we finish in a good place, that everybody feels they've asked all the questions they want. Eve, you've said everything that you want to say, or that you feel you'd like to point people towards, and we'll ask you in a minute to point them where to buy your book. Available in all good bookshops. I absolutely refuse to promote Amazon in this regard. But Eve, is there anything else you particularly sort of is on your mind generally around what you wrote about, or the work that you did in putting together the book, that you think would be helpful for people to hear about?
Well, I think just where we ended up about you're all special, and I think that's what I was left with, is that it's actually not a trivial question. Who are you and why you're here, and what are you doing with your one beautiful life? And I think that it's a moment for us all to really have a think about that, and think about what we're indulging in, what we're promoting, what we're encouraging around us, because at the moment we don't think there is such a thing as robotness, but we can drink coffee and we can go out to the garden and feel what that feels like, and those things are really, really precious and special. So you should go to the beach and take your shoes off and potter about, and appreciate that, and sing loudly in the shower and do all those crazy human things, because they're really, really unusual, and they're technically extraordinary. And as soon as you start trying to get into how would you program intuition into a robot, you start really appreciating just how extraordinary we are. So please enjoy today, just relishing your personhood and enjoying every single moment of feeling that you have every time you have it.
And thank you, Eve. There are a couple of questions actually which may sort of link to be more positive around this, around Tom's saying, where and who can we engage with to stay sane in all of this? And Jonathan is asking, what do you see as the most positive benefits of AI that we could envisage?
So there's a very useful guy on Twitter, I think in other places he does Substacks, called Ethan Mollick, who is he made a name for himself taking very complex academic papers and summarizing them in a way that makes them helpful. And I follow him because he is quite measured about AI and about how it can be used. And he's not sort of hysterical. There's a lot of people who just come up with crazy stuff all the time to freak you out. So I tend to go to him first because I think he's quite measured. I'd also keep an eye on what's happening in the UK with this new research facility that has been opened. I'm trying to remember what the guy is who's running that. I'll have a think about that while we are talking. And what's he called? Matt Clifford. Again, look him up and follow him on Twitter and things. He's actually kind of entrepreneur guy, but has got very interested in tech and AI, and is one of the kind of AI czars. And even though he's quite giddy, he's quite kind of loving the Lego toys, he's also quite sensible. So if you want to be a wee bit scared, but in a safe way, then he's a guy to look at. In terms of positive benefits of AI, I mean, one of the benefits is just to make us realise how totally extraordinary we are, because I think we've been taking each other for granted and, getting giddy about competing with AI by bunging a load of money into STEM so that we're all fantastic at calculus. And frankly, we don't need to be fabulous at calculus anymore. The AI can do that for us. And there's a load of stuff that we thought was maybe important that is really not important anymore because the robots can do that. So I think it will force us through the back door to discover our souls, however you construct those, because that's all the stuff that is not easy to copy and is quite special and precious. And as I said earlier on, I think an AI that was well programmed in terms of the core design might well be able to solve some of these big global problems for us, because it would have more reach than any human could. And I think if you think about our core design and the idea about trying to get the wisdom of crowds, then maybe if an AI could get the wisdom of crowds, that might actually help wiser decision making. So in terms of the book, this is what it looks like. It's not an AI cover because we did do an AI cover and then we were told there'd be copyright issues with it. So it's just a stock photograph, just to be clear. Robot Souls, you can certainly get it online. You can get it from Routledge, I think, postage free. I don't know what bookshops it's in, actually. They're not telling me that. You can certainly get it in Church House Bookshop in Westminster if you're trotting around the big metrop. But I imagine if you just Google it, you'll find it anywhere you like. It will be coming out on audio eventually. They haven't given me a date for that, but those of you who like to listen to your books rather than read them, that will hopefully be coming out soon too. Oh yes, Hugh, there's a question for you about the name of the centre, the Physics Guys. What was that?
It's called the Parry Center. It's the American spelling, CENT. Just PARI into Google, you'll find an entire website. It was created by David Peat in collaboration with David Bohm. And it's based in Italy. So they run many sessions actually in Tuscany if you need a break.
And I'll just put Matt Clifford into the chat because he was the other guy
I
thought was worth looking up.
So, Eve, any final things you want to say before we bring things to a close today?
No, just thank you very much for giving up your breakfast slot for me today. And I hope it was thought-provoking.
No. Thank you very much, Eve. It was brilliant, great conversation. So thank you, everybody. Just so you know, we have our next one is in October, October the 11th, when Nick Roy will be leading us through an exploration of the myth of flatness in organizations. So loads of stuff talked about the benefits of taking hierarchy out of organizations. Nick problematizes that a bit and has some doctoral work on how to look at it. So that's October the 11th. We'll send you all details of it. Meanwhile, Eve, thank you so much, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. It's
Thank
great to see
you,
everyone.
Good conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Quite the best.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.